A sanitation worker in Bogota's Fontibon district followed the same alley route he took every Sunday morning. Nothing unusual, a chill in the air, a line of dumpsters steaming faintly from the city's humidity. But on January 22nd, 2023, something interrupted that routine. A blue hardshell suitcase, slightly ajar, stuffed tightly between two bins behind a supermarket. He thought someone had dumped electronics or stolen goods. He cracked the lid open. Inside was the lifeless body of a young woman, curled unnaturally, limbs compressed by the suitcase's edges. She was dressed in a sequin top. Her headphones were still around her neck. That single discovery triggered one of Colombia's most high-profile international homicide cases in recent years, one that drew not only media attention, but also raised red flags about cross-border relationships, digital surveillance, and intimate partner violence hidden beneath appearances of luxury and affection. The responding officers from Bogota's Metropolitan Police immediately locked down the area. The body appeared intact. No obvious blood pooling, no visible stab wounds, but the contortion of the limbs and bruising along the throat suggested trauma by force. Forensics noted early indications of asphyxiation. The woman had no identification on her. There was a cell phone, cracked, face down, lying several feet from the suitcase. No wallet, no purse, no keys, no defensive wounds. Within an hour, the scene was transitioned to full homicide protocol. Investigators from the Technical Investigation Corps, CTI, were called in. Photographs were taken. Luminol tests were conducted around the suitcase and surrounding concrete. Faint traces of blood fluoresced on the suitcase lining. The zipper bore minor scratches, possibly from fingernails. The suit lining contained what appeared to be a single artificial eyelash, an indicator of struggle during or after death. Initial scene notes flagged a possible body dump. The area showed no signs of a murder taking place there. No blood pooling, no drag marks. The killer, they concluded, had likely transported the body. A forensic pathologist on site estimated the time of death occurred sometime between late Saturday night and early Sunday morning. Ambient temperature, rigor mortis, and lack of insect activity suggested the body had been placed in the suitcase shortly after death and left less than 10 hours before discovery. That evening at CTI headquarters, the cracked phone was powered on under digital forensics protocol. Despite the screen damage, the SIM card was active. Registered to a Colombian service, it had been used to text, call, and video chat regularly with a foreign number over the past week. The last outgoing call, logged at 1:48 a.m. on January 22nd, was made to an American number. The data began to sketch the start of something more troubling. This wasn't random. She wasn't a local transient or an anonymous victim. Her social media accounts, linked through her WhatsApp number, quickly confirmed her identity. Valentina Trespalacios, 23, a well-known electronic music DJ with a rising presence in Bogota and Medellin. Her last Instagram story, posted hours before her death, showed her dancing at a nightclub event, smiling under strobe lights with the caption, "My life, my music." By late Sunday night, her name was trending on Colombian Twitter. She had disappeared less than 24 hours earlier, but her body had already become part of a criminal investigation crossing national borders. Back at the scene, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the supermarket's back alley camera, but the recording ended abruptly at 2:09 a.m., cut off mid-frame. Power disruption? Intentional deletion? The digital forensic team flagged it for deeper recovery analysis. From an adjacent street-facing camera, one blurry still emerged. A man wheeling a large blue suitcase passed a lamppost at 4:36 a.m. His head was down. He wore a white shirt and jeans. There was no way to identify his face. At CTI, Chief Inspector Daniela Lopez noted in her report, the footage showed exactly what it needed to, just enough to confirm the suitcase was moved there, but nothing more. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. Her team pulled traffic camera logs from major intersections leading out of northern Bogota. From a traffic feed 3 miles away, they located what appeared to be the same man entering a ride-hailing vehicle at 4:17 a.m. The car's license plate traced back to a driver who confirmed the pickup. A foreigner, didn't say much. Big suitcase. Told me to go toward the airport area. I dropped him off near a hotel. That driver's tip led them to a temporary address, an Airbnb apartment in the north of the city. The booking was made under the name John N. Poulos, U.S. passport. Check-in, Friday. Check-out, Sunday morning. The same time Valentina Tres Palacios was last seen alive. But no one had seen Poulos since. By 6 a.m., Monday, Colombian authorities had confirmed the victim's identity through SIM registration and a match with her national ID records. Valentina Tres Palacios, 23, Colombian national. The name wasn't unfamiliar to investigators. Several officers had seen her on television or social media. She wasn't a celebrity by international standards, but in Bogotá's electronic music scene, she was well known. Upbeat, marketable, frequently booked. The digital forensics team began with her last used phone. While the device had a cracked screen and minor external damage, the internal memory remained largely intact. They retrieved metadata from WhatsApp, Telegram, and Instagram, focusing on the final 72 hours before death. Most notable were video messages sent Saturday night, short clips taken inside a nightclub booth, time-stamped between 9:30 p.m. and 11:12 p.m., showing Valentina alone at first, then dancing with others. Her geolocation matched a known venue in northern Bogotá. A second layer emerged with a private text chain. Investigators isolated repeated exchanges with a U.S. number registered under a prepaid Verizon SIM. The tone of the messages shifted rapidly across several days. Thursday's messages were affectionate. Fridays showed concern. By Saturday, the tone turned controlling. Commands to share her location, requests to avoid specific friends, pressure to return to the apartment earlier than planned. These were not isolated messages. There were over 70 across that day alone. The last text sent from Valentina's device read, "Estoy llegando, ya voy." Translation, "I'm coming, I'm on the way." Time, 12:11 a.m., Sunday. The device went silent shortly after. No calls, no outgoing messages, no GPS pings beyond the apartment's coordinates. Investigators next examined Valentina's digital calendar. Bookings showed that she had canceled 2 Monday events. A friend who had coordinated one of the sessions told police, "She told me she'd moved in with someone, a foreigner. They were making plans for the future." That statement initiated a deeper background check. Within Colombian immigration logs, an entry was found under the name John Nelson Poulos, U.S. passport. Arrived January 19th. No departure stamp. Cross-checking hotel and private rental records narrowed his stay to one listing, a short-term Airbnb in Chapinero. Records showed 2 guests. Entry logs, uploaded from the building's automated system, confirmed both visitors checked in together on Friday afternoon. Surveillance logs from that building, retrieved under judicial warrant, revealed Valentina arriving with 2 suitcases, one black, one tan. The man accompanying her pushed a third, blue, hard shell, oversized. The same color, size, and brand as the suitcase recovered from the alley. The last footage of Valentina alive showed her entering the elevator around 11:50 p.m. Saturday, alone. She never left the building again. The man exited 5 hours later, rolling the blue suitcase. He had changed clothes. At the same time, agents in Wisconsin pulled Poulos's U.S. criminal record. Clean. No known prior charges. No restraining orders. No federal alerts. But a family law attorney's name appeared in association with his previous address. Divorce proceedings had been filed. 3 children. Shared custody pending review. That for CTI changed the frame of investigation. The possibility of someone violent hiding behind the appearance of wealth or stability was no longer abstract. At this stage, the core forensic discovery centered on digital correspondence, behavior patterns, geolocation confirmation, and access control logs. The data established proximity, intent to cohabitate, and a final window of exclusive contact with the suspect. The challenge now became connecting this timeline to evidence of premeditation or escalation. Among the forensic analysts reviewing the case file, one paused and said quietly, "He was watching every move. She just didn't know it was already the last night." On January 23rd, the investigative unit returned to the Chapinero district, this time with a judicial warrant and a targeted objective. Apartment 803, an Airbnb rental in a mid-tier residential building, had been occupied for less than 48 hours. It was the last verified location where Valentina Tres Palacios had been seen alive. Digital access logs and CCTV footage had already confirmed entry. Now the focus shifted to physical trace collection. The door was unlocked on arrival. Inside, the apartment was in superficial order. Bed made, bathroom door ajar, a suitcase-sized indent in the rug near the balcony door. It appeared no items had been left behind, at least not in plain sight. But forensic protocol dictated a full room sweep. Technicians began with high-contact surfaces, door handles, faucets, light switches. Swab samples were taken for DNA and touch trace. Luminol was deployed in the bathroom and kitchen. No significant blood patterns lit up, just residual smears around the inner lip of the garbage bin, faint and irregular. More importantly, beneath the bed frame, investigators retrieved a torn piece of black mesh fabric, a partial match to the type seen in Valentina's last Instagram video. It wasn't conclusive, but it narrowed the event window. From the closet, a pillowcase was recovered with transfer marks resembling foundation makeup. Under the bathroom sink, a pair of disposable gloves, crumpled, with no fingerprints, were collected and sent for analysis. The apartment's trash had already been emptied, but the building's shared dumpster was secured and transported to CTI's off-site processing unit. Forensic teams would later isolate strands of bleached hair and a used tissue with partial saliva DNA. No wallet, ID, or electronic device belonging to Valentina was found inside the apartment. But what stood out wasn't just the absence of her belongings, it was the overcorrection. The room had been wiped clean to a point where it looked staged. There were no fingerprints on the television remote, doorknobs, or water bottles left behind. The man who left that apartment hadn't simply packed. He'd cleared. Swipe card data corroborated the video footage. One last entry, Sunday morning at 4:12 a.m. One exit, 4:35 a.m. After that, the card was never used again. Digital forensics synced the apartment's Wi-Fi router with connected devices. A single MacBook had joined the network under the name JNP 2023. The IP address usage terminated exactly 2 hours before the body was found. Timing, again, was tight. Too tight. Detectives noted a problem emerging. No trace of forced entry, no noise complaints, no eyewitness accounts of screaming or struggle. Everything inside suggested a quiet departure. This wasn't an escalation, it was a decision. In the post-action case log, Chief Forensic Investigator Mauricio Benitez wrote, "The space was more intact than it should have been. No clutter, no panic cleanup, just controlled removal." That's harder to explain than chaos. Psychological profiling often emphasizes post-crime behavior. A hasty exit, a disorganized scene, would imply panic. But order suggested planning, premeditation, and possibly familiarity with crime scene procedure. The apartment's key fob was still on the counter. The tenant had walked away without it. Investigators secured the site, cataloged the last remaining articles, and submitted the forensic chain to Bogotá's central lab. DNA results would take days, but the digital trail continued to fill in the hours they couldn't see. This chapter's significance wasn't in a single damning discovery. It was the absence of contradiction. No blood, no broken glass, no struggle, just silence, and a sequence that aligned too precisely. And in homicides, when everything is that clean, it usually isn't. By Tuesday morning, Colombian authorities escalated the case from local homicide to international pursuit. What began as the discovery of a body in a suitcase had developed into a cross-border manhunt, initiated through a sequence of verified timestamps, biometric matches, and logistical convergence. The subject last seen with Valentina Tres Palacios, identified by rental documents and immigration data, was no longer in the country. Surveillance triangulation began at El Dorado International Airport. CTI agents retrieved security camera logs across Terminals 1 and 2. On January 22nd, at exactly 6:28 a.m., a man matching the profile from apartment 803 footage entered through the north entrance. He wore the same white polo seen hours earlier, now layered with a black hoodie. He carried one checked suitcase, dark blue matching the container later confirmed to have carried Valentina's body, and a black laptop bag. The check-in counter logs confirmed the destination, Panama City on Copa Airlines flight CM490. The ticket had been booked online 14 hours earlier using a MasterCard tied to a US-based account. The booking name matched the rental documents: John Nelson Poulos. The itinerary included a second flight, Panama to Istanbul, booked as a connecting international transfer. No return ticket. One-way outbound. Customs footage showed no unusual behavior. He cleared security without incident. By 10:32 a.m., he had left Colombian airspace. The timeline became critical. From 4:35 a.m. to 6:28 a.m., less than 2 hours, the suspect had vacated the apartment, transported the suitcase to the dump site in Fontibon, returned to retrieve remaining belongings, and arrived at the airport. Surveillance and time-stamped phone data reinforced that sequence. No gaps remained. Interpol Colombia issued a red notice request by midday. Panamanian authorities were contacted through official diplomatic channels and forwarded the alert to Tocumen International Airport. But by the time Interpol Panama flagged the entry, the suspect had already landed and entered the country legally. At this stage, Colombian CTI teams worked with Homeland Security liaisons and U.S. consular contacts. A risk emerged. If Poulos boarded the flight to Turkey, extradition options would become significantly more complex. Turkey had no direct treaty with Colombia, and extradition of U.S. nationals from a third country without pre-established agreements often failed in practice. At 3:10 p.m. local time, Panamanian officials located the suspect at Gate 21B minutes before boarding. He was detained without resistance. No confession was offered, no legal request was made. He reportedly told police, "I'm being followed. I'm in danger. That woman was with people I didn't trust." Officials took possession of his belongings. Among them, a MacBook with recently deleted files, 2 international SIM cards, both active in Colombia during the previous week, an external hard drive, a burner phone with encrypted messaging apps, $1,800 in U.S. currency, mostly in small bills, travel documents including a U.S. passport and a Turkish e-visa. There were no traces of blood or biological evidence on his person, but a forensic trace team was dispatched to test luggage linings and electronic devices. Metadata pulled from the MacBook confirmed recent connections to the Chapinero apartment's Wi-Fi network and mapped identical timestamps to the building's surveillance logs. Back in Bogotá, the forensic review team processed the blue suitcase itself. Fiber matches from the apartment were identified on the interior lining. A partial print, unusable for ID but consistent in size and pattern, was pulled from the handle. The extradition process began immediately. Within 48 hours, Poulos was transported back to Colombia under official custody. The procedural sequence now included 3 countries, 6 government agencies, and 4 hours of unbroken, time-stamped digital verification. As one CTI investigator wrote in the internal report, "We didn't need a confession. We needed the clock, and he left us that." The case was moving rapidly, too rapidly in some ways. Investigators were cautious not to overinterpret digital alignment. When timelines match too perfectly, it can either suggest calculated orchestration or a misreading of what actually happened inside that narrow window of time. Still, facts were building. What remained unknown was motive. The forensic trail was clean, but silence does not equal innocence. It simply means the next chapter lies not in the gaps, but in what he tried to erase. Once the suspect was back on Colombian soil, investigators shifted their focus from physical evidence to behavioral pattern analysis. The question was no longer how the body got into a suitcase. That had been answered through surveillance, timestamps, and trace evidence. The next layer was why, and whether the behavior leading up to Valentina Tres Palacios' death had already written its own forensic signature. Forensic psychology and financial analysis units began parallel reviews. The goal was simple: establish pre-crime behavior that demonstrated intent, escalation, or coercive control. They started with communication history, spanning months, not days. Using legal warrants, investigators accessed over 1,200 WhatsApp messages between Valentina and the suspect. At first, they followed a familiar pattern: expressions of affection, shared plans, apartment searches. But over time, the language changed. By November 2022, messages included location requests, unexpected video calls, accusations of disloyalty, and requests to limit contact with male friends. While no message alone was criminal, the cumulative tone was controlling. Systematic. They also discovered that the suspect had installed third-party tracking software on a phone previously gifted to Valentina. Logs from the spyware, stored in encrypted backup files on his seized laptop, showed regular updates on her location in Bogota, even when they were not in the same country. This was not casual concern, it was surveillance. On the financial side, investigators uncovered international transfers totaling over $9,000 sent from the suspect's U.S. accounts to Valentina between August 2022 and January 2023. These were labeled as support, expenses, and once pre-honeymoon. The funds weren't tied to a joint account or formal agreement. The motive appeared rooted in control rather than generosity. Credit card logs also showed Airbnb bookings under his name in multiple countries, Colombia, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic, some of which overlapped with Valentina's known DJ gigs. In each case, he appeared to position himself within proximity of her travel schedule. One forensic examiner noted this in the report. Presence mirrored movement. Not coincidental, not spontaneous. When questioned, several of Valentina's close friends said she had expressed unease in the final weeks. Not fear of violence, fear of being monitored. One friend recounted her saying, "It's like he always knows where I am, even when I don't post anything." That detail became important. Investigators traced login attempts to Valentina's private email and Instagram accounts originating from IPs matching the suspect's devices. These attempts increased after she declined to travel with him to the U.S. in December. Behavioral forensics flagged this as pre-incident compulsion. Control was exerted digitally, financially, and geographically. The crime in that context became less about a sudden event and more about a series of tolerated intrusions that escalated quietly. No prior convictions existed. No protective orders had been filed. Yet the psychological trail was clear. Obsession disguised as intimacy. Surveillance framed as concern. What looked like romance in hindsight read like preparation. In towns with fewer resources, these patterns are often dismissed until a body forces the question. This time, the data told the story before anyone had to guess. The autopsy was completed within 48 hours of recovery. Bogotá's National Institute of Legal Medicine conducted the examination with full coordination from the homicide unit. The goal was not just to confirm cause of death, it was to build a forensic sequence that matched or challenged the timeline already reconstructed through digital and physical evidence. Valentina Tres Palacios' body showed no signs of prolonged physical struggle. No fractures in the hands or arms, no defensive wounds on the forearms or wrists. Her fingernails were intact. No traces of skin from a second party were found beneath them. That absence was not overlooked. It suggested a rapid incapacitation, likely from behind or during a moment of lowered awareness. Bruising was concentrated around the neck and jawline. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and conjunctiva confirmed death by asphyxiation. The hyoid bone was fractured, consistent with manual strangulation. Forensic timing placed the estimated time of death between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. on January 22nd, aligning with both the digital device inactivity and apartment exit timestamps. Toxicology returned negative. No alcohol above trace amounts, no sedatives, no recreational drugs. She had not been rendered unconscious chemically. The method was physical, direct, intentional. One critical detail stood out. The compression pattern across the throat had a distinct asymmetric angle. It indicated the assailant had used only one hand during the act, positioned laterally behind the victim. Based on height and reach estimates, this placed the attacker in a dominant physical position, likely seated or standing over her during the event. Clothing analysis showed no tearing or distress. Her outfit matched footage from the nightclub hours earlier. Shoes were missing. Jewelry was intact. There were no signs of sexual assault. The body had been placed in the suitcase post-mortem. No lividity patterns suggested movement after death. Rigor mortis had partially set in by the time she was sealed inside the container. That gave investigators a secondary time marker. The suitcase had been packed between 3:30 and 4 a.m. Within the same window, the suspect was captured on CCTV leaving the apartment. The condition of the body told a quiet, clinical story. There had been no fight, no attempt to flee. The event had happened in close proximity, in silence, and without interruption. This changed how the case was perceived internally. Up to this point, much of the investigation had centered on movement, where Valentina had gone, who she had seen when she stopped answering texts. But now the focus turned inward. What did it mean that no one heard her die? Her death occurred in a city apartment building with multiple tenants. No neighbors reported noise, no thumps, no shouting. Investigators canvassed surrounding units again. Nothing had changed. No audio anomalies had been flagged. The silence became its own evidence. Combined with the forensic absence of resistance, the data supported a chilling theory. Valentina had either been asleep, misled into safety, or overpowered in a moment she didn't expect. No contingency, no warning. The physical report was delivered to prosecutors with full correlation to digital timeframes, apartment surveillance, and known movement logs. It became the anchor point for the prosecution's narrative, that this was not spontaneous. It was prepared, precise, and brief. The body no longer raised questions, it answered them. In doing so, it forced a harder truth into view. Even in proximity, even in love, violence can be quiet, fast, unstoppable, and that's often the point. With the suspect extradited to Colombia and held under pretrial detention, prosecutors moved quickly to solidify the chain of evidence. The goal wasn't just conviction, it was procedural durability. In high-profile international cases, mistakes in early hearings can weaken outcomes later. Everything presented would need to align: forensic results, witness accounts, behavioral patterns, and the physical timeline reconstructed to the minute. The initial interrogation was conducted at the Bogotá Judicial Police Headquarters under standard homicide protocol. The suspect invoked his right to remain silent on key questions, but provided basic personal details. His legal team declined to submit an early statement, citing mental instability and potential coercion during transport. No confession was given. No version of events was voluntarily offered. In response, investigators focused on uncontested facts. They did not need motive speculation. The surveillance trail from the apartment to the dump site, the time-stamped ride-hailing logs, the forensic timeline of the autopsy, all stood independent of testimony. What changed in this phase wasn't the evidence itself. It was how prosecutors began structuring the case. They separated the presentation into 4 integrated frames: physical presence and exclusive access, establishing that no one else entered or exited apartment 803 during the critical hours between 11:50 p.m. and 4:30 a.m., apart from the victim and the suspect. Digital silence, demonstrating that Valentina's phone went inactive exactly when apartment surveillance showed no further movement from her. Post-crime concealment, tracing the suitcase from apartment to vehicle to dump site, corroborated by footage, GPS, and ride app data. Flight behavior, showing that the suspect purchased a one-way ticket and attempted to leave Colombian jurisdiction without notice. This 4-part structure avoided narrative overreach. No dramatic reenactments, no theoretical motive, just movement, data, and body condition. The defense in pretrial hearings attempted to introduce reasonable doubt based on the absence of eyewitnesses and alleged ambiguous intent. Their argument leaned on the lack of audible struggle, no direct confession, and the possibility of accidental death. But forensic reports had already disqualified those angles. The compression force in the neck fractures, the pattern of bruising, the lack of defensive wounds, it all pointed to a fast, calculated act, not spontaneous aggression. From a judicial standpoint, this wasn't a case in need of emotional argumentation. Prosecutors were careful not to rely on the victim's social media or public profile. The trial strategy was clinical. They focused on Valentina as a citizen under protection of the law, not as a public figure. During these preparations, the victim's family remained quiet. No press statements, no televised interviews. What mattered now was not public sentiment, but admissibility and legal clarity. Internally, the prosecution team noted a subtle challenge. While the forensic evidence was strong, the absence of a confession meant that jurors or judges would need to rely entirely on the reconstruction of data, not narrative testimony. That's why they emphasize precision, not how it felt, but what it showed. When the evidence was clean, there was no need to embellish. The suitcase had been found. The body had spoken. The timelines matched. The silence once again told its own story. On May 2nd, 2023, the trial of John Nelson Poulos formally commenced in a Bogota courtroom under heightened security. There was no jury. Colombian homicide cases of this nature are adjudicated by professional judges. The defendant, a U.S. national, sat without visible emotion. He declined to speak. Prosecutors led with structure, not drama. They presented a linear case: the apartment access logs, the timestamp surveillance, the autopsy sequence, and the uninterrupted digital trail that tracked his every move. From the moment Valentina Tres Palacios entered the apartment until her body was found in a public dumpster. The defense argued the absence of a witness, the lack of a confession, and the possibility of an accident during a private disagreement. But cross-examination of forensic experts quickly dismantled that premise. The angle and force of the neck trauma, the uninterrupted digital timeline, and the absence of defensive wounds pointed to one conclusion: intentional, controlled violence. Witnesses were limited. Valentina's family did not testify directly but submitted a written statement. The court allowed it to be read during closing arguments, not for emotional weight, but to acknowledge the victim as more than a dataset. On May 23, 2023, the presiding judge issued the sentence: 42 years and 8 months in prison for aggravated feminicide and tampering with physical evidence. No parole eligibility, no repatriation to the United States. The courtroom remained quiet. Outside, the case sparked brief but focused public protest. Feminist advocacy groups cited it as another example of systemic risk faced by women, even those with visibility and economic independence. For law enforcement, it became a model of procedural precision, a case not built on motive or witness accounts, but on timing, data, and unbroken forensic logic. In the months following, Colombia's Interior Ministry quietly introduced a policy review for visa background screening involving repeat short-term visitors with romantic links to Colombian citizens. There was no headline, just a memo. Valentina's name remained in circulation, not as a DJ, not as an influencer, but as the central figure in a case where evidence spoke louder than anyone could. In the end, she said nothing, and she didn't have to. The record spoke for her. If there's one thing I've learned from telling this story, it's that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's a warning, sometimes it's evidence, and sometimes it's the last thing someone leaves behind before their voice is taken. In a world where technology records nearly everything, we still need to listen to each other, to patterns, and to the quiet signs that something's wrong. Valentina's story isn't just about a crime, it's about what happens when control hides behind affection and danger wears the face of love. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you pause, tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from? What did this case make you reflect on? If you didn't like this video, I want to hear that too. What didn't sit right and why? And if you want more real stories that matter, that make us think, feel, and see clearer, subscribe to the channel. You being here means something. Let's keep these conversations going.